A young pilot dropped out of the clouds that morning, his Zero trailing smoke like a dying comet. The deck crews on the carrier froze when they saw him coming straight in. He wasn't diving like a killer. He wasn't strafing. He wasn't even holding altitude anymore. His landing gear were down, trembling in the wind. Every gunner on that deck tightened his grip, wondering if this was some new trick. The fighter wobbled, losing speed fast, barely holding the sky together. The men on the ship braced themselves, convinced they were seconds away from an explosion. Instead, the engine coughed once and quit completely. The Zero dropped toward the deck like a wounded bird, and somehow, against every rule of war and common sense, it landed alive in the middle of an American carrier. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. It keeps these old stories reaching folks like us. And tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is. If it's getting late, take care of yourself first. We're not 20 anymore. You can always come back to this story later. That young pilot was Tadayoshi Koga, just 20 years old, flying a machine that had already taken more hits than any aircraft should be able to survive. He'd been shot up in a wild scramble hours earlier, shoved out of formation by a pair of Hellcats that came down on him from the sun. You know how sudden those meetings in the Pacific could be. One heartbeat of quiet sky, and the next full of gunfire. Koga dove into a bank of cloud to shake his pursuers. But when he came out the other side, he didn't recognize a single thing around him. No coastline. No friendly ship. Just the wide open sea breathing under him and a Zero that kept groaning with every gust. His fuel was bleeding away. His radio was dead. And the engine felt like it wanted to leap out of the airframe. A pilot can take a lot. But when the machine rebels against you, that's when you start thinking about the ocean beneath you. Koga looked for land, any land, and instead found the last thing he ever wanted to see. A carrier group. American, big, loud, alive with activity, and absolutely ready to kill anything with a red circle on the wings. For a moment, he tried to convince himself the ship might be Japanese, but even a scared kid can only lie to himself so long. Every silhouette was wrong. Every deck marking glaringly American. Every aircraft parked topside shaped like something built to punch hard and take a hit. He knew exactly what they'd do if he tried to turn away, and he knew what would happen if he stayed in the air a few minutes longer. That kind of choice isn't really a choice at all. And anyone who's ever been in trouble up there can tell you that. He lowered his landing gear, steadied the stick, and lined up with a deck full of men who still didn't know what they were looking at. On the bogue. Alarms went off, boots hammered across planks, and guns swung toward the incoming fighter. But there was something strange about the way the Zero limped toward them, slow, sagging, almost apologetic. Commander Harold Dixon studied it through binoculars, and you can imagine the look on his face when he realized the kid wasn't attacking. Even old sailors who'd seen everything were stunned by a Japanese fighter trying to land, not fight, on their own carrier. The wind coming off the bow shoved the Zero around like a toy. Koga fought it, shoulders locked, vision tunneling down the length of the deck. The LSO stood frozen, paddles useless in his hands, because guiding a Zero wasn't exactly in the manual. 50 feet, 30, 20. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died, leaving nothing but dead air under the nose. The fighter hit hard, bounced once, skidded sideways, its hook scraping across wire after wire until the fourth one finally caught and snapped it to a brutal stop. Then everything went silent. A whole carrier, packed with men ready to fight, held its breath as the smoke drifted past them. And there in the cockpit sat a boy who had no idea how he was still alive. The moment that Zero stopped moving, the entire deck seemed to hold its breath. Smoke drifted past the wings, the wires trembled from the sudden strain, and for a long second, no one dared take a single step closer. Then, the canopy twitched. Just a tiny movement. But on a wartime carrier, that was enough to make every man tighten his grip on his weapon. Most of those sailors had only ever seen a Zero at full speed, slicing through the sky like a razor. Now one sat 20 yards from them, alive, steaming, and carrying a pilot who was supposed to hate them enough to die before letting this moment happen. Koga pushed the canopy open with shaking hands, his breath fogging the glass for a heartbeat before the wind scattered it. He stayed still, both palms raised slowly, a gesture so universal that even in the middle of war, nobody misunderstood it. He looked impossibly young, thin, pale under the grime and smoke, with a smear of oil across his cheek and a cut slowly tracing a line of blood above his brow. A couple of sailors whispered to each other, not out of fear but out of the shock of seeing the enemy reduced to something so painfully human. It's a strange thing, seeing a man up close after years of firing at silhouettes and tracer lines. Your mind takes a moment to adjust, almost like it refuses to accept that the person in front of you breathes the same way you do. Two deckhands approached, rifles ready but barrels lowered, moving as cautiously as if the kid were a wounded animal that might bolt. Koga tried to climb out, but the moment his boots touched the deck, his legs buckled. He didn't fall you, though, because instinct kicked in for the men closest to him, and they caught him by the arms before he hit the planks. Imagine that for a moment. A Japanese pilot who had been trained to expect nothing but brutality, suddenly held upright by the very men he was taught to destroy. That kind of collision between two worlds can shake something loose inside you, even if you don't notice it yet. Koga didn't say a word, but his eyes darted across the deck, taking in everything at once. The Wildcats lined up with their wings folded. The Avengers parked near the elevators. The deck crew in white vests shouting orders that carried clean over the wind. He had never seen anything like it. The rhythm of the ship was different from anything he knew back home. Tighter, smoother, almost industrial in its precision. To him, it must have felt like stepping into the engine room of a machine far bigger than the war he'd been flying in. Commander Dixon approached, his boots tapping a slow, steady beat on the boards. He gave Koga the kind of look a man gives a stray dog that somehow wandered into his yard, not sure whether to be impressed or bewildered. But he kept his voice calm, not harsh or mocking, just steady enough to cut through the wind. You could tell by the way he stood that he understood the moment, understood the eyes on him, understood that everyone on that deck would remember what he said next. And so he said the only thing that fit the situation without making anything worse. He told his men to secure the pilot, and he said it the same way he might have said secure a wounded American. The sailors guided Koga toward the island structure, still holding his arms because his legs refused to cooperate. Some of the crew stared as he passed, Not with hostility, but with amazement, as if history had reached down and pressed pause on the day just to let them witness something impossible. A few whispered under their breath about how small he was, how he looked barely old enough to shave. It wasn't meant cruelly. It was the kind of remark men make when they suddenly realize the enemy isn't made of steel, but bone and breath and fear. And Koga felt that. Every step, every glance, he could feel the weight of shame rising inside him, the voice of every instructor he ever had telling him that surrender was worse than death. But he also felt something else creeping into the edges of his mind, something he hadn't expected when he first saw the carrier rising from the sea. He felt alive, painfully, confusingly alive. Alive enough to notice the warmth of the sun on his face and the smell of aviation fuel in the air. Alive enough to realize he had crossed into a world built by the men he'd been ordered to fear. The sailors led him below deck, down the tight metal corridors that hummed with the heartbeat of the ship, deeper and deeper into the belly of a machine that seemed too vast for one frightened pilot to comprehend. But even as they walked, even as he tried to steady his breathing, he couldn't shake the sensation that something was waiting for him down there, something he wasn't prepared to face. And he was right, because the moment that door closed behind him, the real shock of his life was about to begin. They brought Koga into a narrow compartment deep inside the carrier, a space no bigger than a walk-in closet, with a metal bench bolted to the wall and the faint hum of engines vibrating under his boots. The door shut behind him with a heavy clang, the kind of sound that tells a man his world has just become much smaller. Two Marines stood outside, quiet and still, not saying a thing, and that silence pressed on him harder than any set of chains could. He sat there with his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles hurt, bracing himself for the first blow, the first shout, the first sign that everything he'd been taught about Americans was finally about to happen. But instead of boots stomping in or fists flying, the door opened gently, almost politely, and a Navy medic stepped inside carrying a small kit. The man didn't bark orders, didn't glare, didn't raise his voice. He just knelt down in front of the young pilot, as if he were treating one of their own boys after a rough landing. That alone was enough to make Koga's breath catch. He leaned back a little, unsure whether this was a trick, unsure whether the touch of a stranger would bring pain or something even worse. The medic looked up at him with a steady calm that came from long nights patching up men who barely made it home. "Hold still," he said, and his voice carried no threat, only focus. He cleaned the cut above Koga's brow with a bit of antiseptic that stung enough to make the boy flinch. Not a single reaction from the medic changed, not a hint of cruelty, just the same slow, patient movements you'd see from someone fixing a cracked instrument panel. There was a kind of dignity in it, the quiet dignity of a man who believed every wounded soul deserved to be treated with respect, even if that soul had flown straight at his ship an hour earlier. Koga didn't understand that kind of contradiction, couldn't fit it into the picture Japan had painted for him. A picture where Americans were monsters and surrender meant your spirit had already turned to ash. He didn't speak, but the confusion in his eyes was louder than any word he could have formed. When the medic finished, he handed him a paper cup of water, cold and clean, the kind that tasted like it came from a world untouched by the shortages and chaos of his home airfields. Koga hesitated, looking at the cup as though it might disappear if he blinked. "Go ahead," the medic murmured. "It's yours." And something in the way he said it, soft but firm, made Koga lift it slowly and drink. That first swallow hit him like a wave, washing through the dust of hours spent fighting to stay alive. You could almost see the tension bleed out of his shoulders as he lowered the cup. The medic gave him a small smile, the kind you'd give a man who'd been through too much. And then he stood and left without another word. Koga stared at the door long after it closed, replaying what had just happened in his mind, because it didn't fit, not with anything he had been taught to believe. His instructors back home drilled him with stories of brutality, of torture, of Americans who mocked dying men. But the first American he met treated him not like a trophy, not like a threat, but like a patient. That truth hit harder than any bullet he had dodged earlier, carving deep into the fear that had ruled him since the moment he saw the carrier rising from the sea. Up above him, the sounds of the ship kept moving, the thud of boots, the rumble of machinery, the pulse of a floating city carrying out its own rhythm. He closed his eyes and imagined his Zero sitting on the deck, surrounded by curious hands and sharp eyes, men who saw his aircraft not as a symbol of imperial pride, but as an opportunity, a puzzle waiting to be solved. He felt shame swelling in his chest, heavy and cold, but intertwined with something else he didn't want to admit. Relief. A quiet, unwelcome sense of relief that he was still breathing inside a ship meant to be his grave. He stayed like that for a long time, letting his thoughts spiral, letting the contradictions war inside him. The stories of American cruelty rattled around in his head, clashing with the cool water on his tongue and the clean bandage above his brow. It made him wonder which world was real, and which was the invention of men who needed their pilots ready to die. And just as he started to settle into that uneasy silence, just as he took his first full breath since leaving the cockpit, the door latch clicked again. Only this time, it wasn't a medic stepping through. It was someone who would challenge his beliefs in a way he never saw coming. The man who stepped into the compartment wasn't armed, wasn't loud, and carried no medical kit. He wore an officer's uniform and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent years navigating the tight corridors of a warship. More importantly, he spoke Japanese with the smooth, careful tone of a man who'd used the language long before the war forced it into his job description. "Ensign Koga," he said gently, "may I sit?" The way he asked, not commanded, made Koga straighten a little, unsure whether to bow or brace. He nodded, and the officer eased down beside him, leaving just enough space to show respect without giving the impression of fear. A man who knew how to talk across worlds. The officer explained that the captain and commander wanted to ask a few questions, not about secret bases or codes, just about Koga's injuries and the events of the morning. Koga kept his gaze on the floor, convinced this calm was just the first layer of something harsher that waited beneath. But the officer's voice never sharpened. If anything, it grew softer, as if he recognized the young pilot's confusion and didn't wish to push him further into panic. "You were told many things about us," he said, "and not all of them were true." That sentence lingered between them, heavier than any threat. Koga swallowed hard, and for the first time since waking up that morning, he spoke, barely above a whisper. "Capture brings shame." The officer translated the words later, but in that moment, He simply nodded, as though he understood how much it cost Koga to say them out loud. When the meeting ended and Koga was escorted back to his compartment, the ship seemed louder somehow. Boots clattered overhead, voices rose and fell, the entire vessel humming with purpose. He sat alone again, listening to the pulse of the carrier, when a new sound filtered through the metal walls. It was faint at first, like the tapping of tools against a stubborn latch. Then it grew clearer, sharper, mixed with muffled orders and the scrape of heavy panels sliding free. Koga froze. He knew that sound. Anyone who had ever flown a Zero knew it. His aircraft was being pulled apart above him. Up on the flight deck, the mood was electric. Engineers, mechanics, intelligence officers, and half the ship's curious sailors swarmed around the captured fighter like kids at a carnival. The Zero sat under the open sky, its paint scorched, and its wings still trembling slightly from the landing. Addison, the chief engineer, crouched under the nose with a flashlight, muttering like a man discovering buried treasure. "Look at the weight savings," he said, running his hand along the engine mounts. "Everything is minimal. Every ounce shaved off." A deckhand tapped the wing gently with a knuckle and shook his head. "Feels like paper." One mechanic leaned into the cockpit. No armor, fuel lines exposed. My God, no wonder they turned so well. And they weren't mocking it. They were admiring it, the way craftsmen admire a rival's work, impressed despite themselves. Panels came off one by one, each piece carried carefully by hands that understood exactly how valuable every rivet might be. Cameras clicked, measurements were shouted, and men scribbled notes like they were documenting a relic from another world. To them, this wasn't the enemy's plane. It was a blueprint for survival, a chance to learn why American pilots had feared the Zero early in the war, and how to turn that fear into tactics that could save lives. Commander Dixon watched from the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, eyes focused on every movement. He looked like a man witnessing history being rewritten in real time. Down below, Koga heard every metallic echo. He closed his eyes, imagining each bolt being loosened, each panel lifted away, each secret of Japanese engineering revealed. It felt like someone dissecting a part of his soul. That plane wasn't just a machine to him. It was pride, duty, the very symbol of the world he belonged to. Now it was being peeled open like a tin of food, exposed to hands that didn't speak his language or share his allegiance. His breath trembled. He gripped the edge of the bench until his fingers turned white. Shame washed over him, not because of the Americans pulling the plane apart, but because deep down, he knew he had delivered it to them himself. A single wrong turn, a cloud bank in the wrong place, a dying engine. And now his country's prized fighter sat under foreign eyes. And yet, beneath the shame was that same unwelcome whisper he felt earlier. Relief. He hated himself for it, but he couldn't deny it. He was Aleph, and if staying alive meant hearing the slow unmaking of his Zero, then he had chosen this fate the moment he lowered his landing gear. Up on deck, Addison straightened and wiped his hands on a rag, grinning like a man who'd just cracked open a safe. "We can learn everything from this," he told Dixon. Every weakness, every limit, every edge. Dixon nodded, understanding exactly what that meant. And the boy who brought it to us, he said quietly, didn't even mean to. Below deck. Koga lifted his head at the faint vibration of an engine test above him. He didn't know the full truth yet. He didn't know what the Americans were planning. But he was about to find out. And it would shake him harder than anything he'd faced so far. Koga didn't sleep that night. The ship never truly slept either, its engines humming like a giant heartbeat in the dark. But it was the noise above him that kept his thoughts spinning. Every tap of a wrench, every scrape of a panel sliding free, every murmur drifting down the steel bulkheads reminded him that the Zero was being stripped open under foreign hands. He sat on the edge of the metal bench, elbows on his knees, fingers laced so tightly his knuckles felt carved from stone. He tried to picture what his commanders would say if they saw him now, alone, unarmed, and listening to the slow unraveling of everything he'd sworn to defend. Shame weighed on him like lead. But the ship didn't care about shame. It only cared about movement. A few hours after dawn, the latch on his door clicked again. The same Japanese-speaking officer stepped inside, carrying a small notebook and an expression that wasn't pity. Wasn't coldness, but something balanced in between. "Ensign Koga," he said quietly. "The captain would like a word with you." Koga stiffened, expecting at last the harsh interrogation he'd been taught to fear. But when he followed the officer through the narrow corridors, past sailors who barely looked up from their work, he sensed something else in the air. Curiosity. Not hatred. Not triumph. Just a strange curiosity. The kind men feel when a story they never expected to witness suddenly unfolds in front of them. They guided him into a briefing room barely bigger than a storage closet. A small table sat in the center, polished enough to reflect the overhead light, and behind it stood Captain Giles and Commander Dixon. Both men looked at him not like a threat, not like a prize, but like a young pilot caught in a storm he never intended to fly into. The officer motioned for him to sit, then took a place beside him, ready to translate. Koga kept his hands on his thighs, palms pressed flat, waiting for the blow that had been delayed too long. Captain Giles spoke first. His tone was even, steady. The voice of a man used to delivering orders that could change the tide of a day or the course of a life. "We have questions," he said, "but none of them about Japanese secrets. We only want to understand what happened to you this morning." Koga blinked, surprised enough that he almost forgot to breathe. The captain wasn't leaning forward, wasn't interrogating. He was simply trying to piece together how a wounded pilot had drifted into the center of their world. Through the translator, they asked about the dogfight, the cloud bank, the engine failure, the moment he realized he'd have to land or die in the sea. Koga answered with short, clipped sentences, each one sounding like it had to fight its way out of his throat. He didn't look up, didn't dare meet their eyes. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the shame of surviving when every rule of his world said he shouldn't have. At one point, Dixon leaned in a little, resting his forearms on the table. "Son," he said, "you chose to live. That isn't shame. That's survival." The translator repeated the words, but the weight of them didn't need translation. They landed like a stone in Koga's chest. Heavy. Undeniable. and frightening in their honesty. All his life. He'd been told that death was honorable and surrender meant your spirit had rotted. But here sat two enemies telling him that living, just living, had value. When the questions wound down, the captain dismissed the guards and gestured for Koga to remain a moment longer. The officer beside him shifted in his seat, folding his hands slowly. "You're struggling with more than fear," he said gently. Koga didn't answer, but the silence was all the admission needed. The officer continued, his voice softening. "You were taught that we would hate you, that we would hurt you, that your life would end the moment you were captured. But yesterday, you saw something different." Koga stared at the floor, shame and confusion twisting in his chest like two ropes pulled tight. "I do not understand your kindness," he whispered. The officer let out a slow breath. "It isn't kindness," he said. "It's humanity. War or not, you are a pilot, a man, and men deserve dignity." Koga felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. He blinked hard, but the sting behind his eyes refused to fade. And then he asked the question that had been eating at him since the moment he raised his hands on the deck. "What if home no longer wants me?" The officer looked at him with an expression Koga didn't know how to read, something closer to compassion than anything he'd seen since the war began. "Then you build a new one," the officer said quietly. The words echoed in the small room like a verdict from a world Koga had never imagined. They escorted him back toward the lower decks, but just before they reached his compartment, the officer paused. "There is something else you should know," he said. "Your aircraft is being prepared for transport to the mainland. American engineers have never had a Zero like this, and what they discover may change everything." Koga felt the floor tilt beneath him, the words sinking deep. And the moment he stepped back into his compartment, he realized he was about to learn just how much everything was about to change. Koga sat alone after the officer left, replaying that last sentence in his mind, the one about his Zero changing everything. He didn't know how. He didn't know when. But the certainty in the officer's voice made his stomach twist. Above him, the ship felt more alive than ever, vibrating with footsteps, tools, and the restless energy of men who had found something worth losing sleep over. Every sound that traveled down those steel bulkheads felt like a reminder that his world was unraveling bolt by bolt on the deck above. Up top, the hangar bay buzzed like a hornet nest. The engineers were already lowering the Zero from the flight deck, guiding it with ropes and hand signals, treating it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for an American prototype. They cleared a wide space and rolled the fighter into the light. And suddenly, everyone who had even the slightest interest in aviation seemed to appear from nowhere. You could hear the excitement in their voices, not wild, not careless, but sharp and focused, the way a man sounds when he knows he's looking at something that might save lives. Addison wiped his hands on a rag and circled the plane again, eyes narrowed in concentration. He ran a hand along the wing root as if feeling for secrets hidden in the metal. "This thing," he said to Dixon, "is a masterclass in efficiency." Dixon leaned in beside him, studying the stripped panels and the exposed ribs of the fuselage. You could tell he was thinking the same thing every pilot up there had been thinking since Pearl Harbor. If they understood how this machine danced, how it climbed, how it rolled, they could finally turn the tide in the air. The intelligence team worked quickly, sketching diagrams, making measurements, documenting everything down to the angle of the control horns. Every detail mattered. Even the way the cables were routed told a story, one written by engineers who valued maneuverability over protection. That trade-off had baffled American pilots at first, because they were used to machines built like sledgehammers that could take a beating and still come home. But the Zero was a scalpel. Light, precise, deadly. When used by an expert hand, understanding that difference wasn't just interesting, it was vital. One officer pointed at the fuel lines running along the cockpit sidewall and shook his head. No armor, not a shred. If a round touched this, she'd go up like dry grass. Another measured the wings and whistled. That's why they roll so fast. You could hear the pieces falling into place in real time. The puzzle that had frustrated American flyers early in the war suddenly revealing its answers. Dixon stepped back and exhaled slowly. "This isn't just a lucky capture," he said. "This is a turning point." Addison nodded. "Sir, with this we can teach every pilot exactly what they're fighting, where it excels, where it breaks. And once they know that, the advantage shifts." That single sentence echoed across the hangar, because everyone knew what he meant. If the Americans learned how to neutralize the Zero's strengths, if they taught their pilots how to fight it smart instead of fighting it head on, the numbers would change, the survival rate would change, the war in the air would change. While all of that unfolded above, Koga sat below deck with his palms resting against the cold metal of the bulkhead. He couldn't see the hangar, but he could imagine it with painful clarity. He could picture the men clustered around his aircraft, studying it not with hatred, but with purpose, peeling away every secret he was supposed to protect until nothing was left hidden. He felt the shame settle deeper, but underneath it was something harder to name. A slow, quiet realization that his survival had consequences stretching far beyond himself. And as he closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath, a new vibration rolled through the walls, a deeper one. The kind that meant the ship's elevators were moving again. Something was being brought up, something important, and Koga sensed, without anyone telling him, that whatever rose toward the sunlight now would bring him face to face with a truth he wasn't ready to see. The elevator's rumble faded, leaving only the steady heartbeat of the carrier and the faint clatter of tools somewhere far above. Koga kept his hand on the bulkhead, feeling every tremor, each one a reminder that his aircraft was no longer his. But as the minutes passed, something inside him shifted. The shame was still there. Yes, heavy and familiar, but now it mixed with a new awareness that he couldn't ignore. His Zero wasn't being destroyed. It was being understood. And in war, understanding could be more powerful than any bullet fired in anger. Later that afternoon, the guards returned, not with the stiffness of men escorting a threat, but with the quiet routine of people doing their duty. They guided him through the narrow corridors toward a compartment he had never seen before. When the door opened, warm light poured out, revealing a small room with a real bunk, a clean blanket, a desk bolted to the floor, and a tiny slit of a window that let in the gold of the late afternoon sun. On the desk sat a tray of food, simple but generous, more than he had eaten in days. Rice, chicken, bread, water. It startled him how ordinary it all looked. Kogo ate at the small table and lifted the spoon with trembling fingers. At first he ate mechanically, the way a man eats because he knows he must. But hunger took over. And the meal that should have reminded him of captivity instead reminded him that he was still alive, that he could still taste, still breathe, still feel warmth on his skin. That survival, even in enemy hands, still had weight. Across from him, taped neatly to the wall, was a small photograph. Someone had taken it during the chaos of the capture, the Zero sitting on deck with sailors gathered around it. Koga stared at it a long time. His aircraft was gone. His mission was over. His future was no longer in his hands. But the boy in that cockpit, the one who had fought through smoke and fear and failing engines, was still breathing. Still here, still capable of some next chapter he couldn't yet imagine. And that realization, quiet as it was, seemed to settle into his bones. You know, when you look at a moment like that from the outside, it's easy to judge a man for surviving. Easy to say he should have chosen death, or honor, or whatever word people like to use when they're safe and far from danger. But when you're up there in the sky with a dying engine and the sea rising to swallow you, survival isn't cowardice. It's courage. A different kind. A quieter kind. But courage all the same. The Americans knew it. Some part of Kogo was starting to know it too. Outside his window, the sky over the Philippine Sea burned in deep orange streaks as the sun dropped toward the horizon. The ship moved steadily forward, carrying him into a future he couldn't predict. He didn't know if Japan would ever accept him back. He didn't know if the world after the war would have a place for a pilot who survived by accident rather than design. But the words of the Japanese-speaking officer echoed through him. Then you build a new one. And that was the truth of it. A painful truth. A liberating truth. Depending on how you held it. Sometimes a life breaks in half, and the only way forward is to build the next piece yourself. I'll tell you something. Friend, stories like Koga's stay with you because they force you to ask the hard questions most men avoid until they're older, until they've seen enough to know what survival really costs. If you had been in that cockpit, low on fuel with the sea waiting below, would you have chosen death for pride or life for possibility? And when you look back at your own years, how many times did choosing to live, to adapt, to take one more breath, quietly change everything around you? If you've stayed with me this far, give this video a like. It helps more than you'd think. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and join us. These old stories only matter because folks like you keep listening. Koga didn't know it then, sitting alone in that small room, but his survival would echo across the Pacific in ways he'd never hear about. He had lost everything he thought defined him, but he still had the most important thing and can carry into the next dawn. He was still alive.